Meanwhile, let us find out about some of the local poisonings, because as it happens, there are two really nice local poisonings, I say nice in the loosest sense, that happen on the 9th and the 10th of June in different years. So I thought, and they're both arsenic as well. So that's an excuse to tell those two stories, and also a bit sort of more generally in terms of arsenic poisoning. In 1614, Croke, who's an important Justice of the Peace at the time, explains why poison is thought of quite so badly as being the worst and most horrible crime. 1, because it is secret. 2, because it is not to be prevented. And 3, because it is most against nature and therefore most heinous. And 4, it is also a cowardly thing. Unfortunately, things being secret and also cowardly tend to be associated with them also being feminine. So the assumption is that poison is the weapon of the woman who won't just go up to someone and stab them. And to be fair, it's one of the very few categories where there are actually more female cases, female criminals involved, if you look at all the court cases from that time. It's also very much a crime within the family. Almost every case in the Northeast you get from this time happens amongst household, if not amongst family members. Well, you know, that's just because it's easier to poison someone if you're sharing a house with them, I think. So if we look at the cases, the decades a little before and a little after 1700, you get maybe 10 cases of poisoning that way, and all of them are set around household. And in all but one, and that's one of the ones that we're going to look at, the woman is the poisoner, and it's pretty much always either a mistress killing a wife or a wife killing a husband. So it's always about the love triangles, and that does fit the stereotypes of the time. They exist for a reason, you know. Reginald Scott, who is generally a rational figure of the Elizabethan era in as much as such a thing is possible, says that women are the first inventors and greatest practitioners of poison. There are several choices for your poisoning substance. You could use mercury, or you could use something related to opium. But arsenic is by far the commonest, by far the most obvious. It's colourless, it's nearly tasteless if you prepare it properly. I'm not giving you tips on how to do that. It is readily available at the time. It's readily available as pest control. One person who gets it at the time says that they need it to kill a wild dog, a feral dog that's been pestering them. Someone else goes and buys what they call rattan bread, which obviously is a arsenic-based thing for the killing of rats. And it's even available as a medicine in low enough doses. So you could just go to the apothecary, and if you went to 5 different apothecaries, and that's what some of these poisoners did, you could get enough. You couldn't necessarily buy enough in one place unless you had a good story, and possibly it seems that the apothecary might notice that you were buying that much. But if you went to 5 different places around town, nobody's going to join the dots, really. And what seems to happen is people send their servants with a little note saying it's all right to give her the arsenic, and the servant, you send out 3 different servants, different places, nobody ever connects it up. So I'm going to talk about these 2 particular instances, which are a little out of the ordinary, but also happen to be the ones that happen in June. So on the 9th of June in 1662, there is a particularly unpleasant scene happens in Newcastle jail. Now, this story starts with a chap called John Mennin. In the records, he describes himself as a skipper. Everybody else describes him as a labourer, which probably means he's a keelman, I think, because that means he's technically in control of his own boat, but his actual work is very much that of a labourer, and that's a very common profession if you're living on Sandgate. So I think that's what's going on here. And he's been married for 30 years to a lady called Anne Mennin, who has somehow slowly gained a reputation as a witch. And we can see the court records that relate to this. We know that in August 1661, she was in front of the courts. It was always in August that the assizes courts came up to the north, and they only came up once a year because, you know, far too cold and the roads are too difficult, apparently, and, you know, the money's not as good to do it in winter. So August it was, and she was in court with 3 other women for a particular case of poisoning. They are all found not guilty and let back out again. In October, someone else comes up to a Justice of the Peace and says, no, Anne Mennin, she's definitely a witch. And his proof, in as much as he has any, is that While she was in jail for the completely unrelated other offence, his 3 children got better. And when she was let out again and she was found innocent, they got worse again. So clearly it's her that's been tormenting them. At which point she gets dragged back into jail. And she's going to be waiting there. This is, she's been out from late August until October. She's due to be waiting there until August again. This is pretty miserable for all concerned, obviously. Now, someone else was accused of witchcraft at the same time, and actually by the same person, a chap called Thomas Sherburne, who's a local woolen draper. The funny thing is, every source I can find, including my own writing, my own notes from this years and years ago, say that the accusation of Thomas Sherburne against her happened in 1667. I think it's a typo. Either the scribe wrote it down wrongly, or it was a particularly flowery 1 that got turned into a 7, and then it got misfiled, because it makes so much more sense for the story. All the pieces fit together so much better. And it would be really weird for what happened to have happened in 67. So I think it actually was 61, because what we do know for certainty is that this lady, named Emmy Gaskin, was also in prison at the same time as Anne, and we know this because she ends up being a witness to what happened. And so they'd both been there since October 61. They were both still there in June 62. They had 2 months left to wait, but they'd already been there all that time. And by June, according to a later statement of her husband, Anne Mennin had been in prison for the space of 2 years at several times. So she's been in and out of prison to have been there for 2 full years. That's at least 2 previous accusations. So over the first half of that year, John had sent meals to her 3 times. How generous of him. Because, of course, she's on pretty terrible food rations in the jail. So he was kind enough to send her some roast beef and ale on New Year's Day. And in the 6 months since then, he had 3 times sent her about 1 litres worth of grain. How kind of him. And on the 8th of June, he did this again. He sent her a quarter beetment of meal. And she eats this oatmeal. And the next thing she says is to Emmy Gaskin, who's also in there for witchcraft, and they've obviously made friends. I pray God there be nothing but what is good amongst this meal. Whether she started to feel ill already. She starts throwing up, and she dies the following day. One thing that's interesting about this case, it's very unusual to actually have someone in jail while they get murdered. And obviously the jailer is called in, and the jailer really wants to get to the bottom of this, because he's supposed to be actually, not looking after these people, but making sure they don't die in advance. And a couple of local barber surgeons get called in, and they open up her stomach, and they find traces of arsenic in her stomach. And a servant of the jailer is also ordered to sift through what she didn't eat, what was left of the meal, and the same white powder is found in that as well. And although that doesn't seem like doing much investigation, it's still more than a lot of people got at this time. The idea of actually trying to find the poison and to match the meal to the stomach was relatively new at that time in sort of standard legal practice. So John is charged with the murder of his wife, and so is a lady called Jane Ackerman. She's the housekeeper, and she is, according to her own testimony, she's a married woman, but she'd been abandoned by her own husband, and she had moved in to live with John, and she'd been living there as the housekeeper, doing the washing and the cooking for about a year. It's never raised in questioning whether they're having an affair, but I think reading between the lines, it's pretty likely that they are. Sadly, because of the nature of the court records at this time, I don't know whether either of them was found guilty. The document that will say whether either of them is found guilty is a little tiny scrap of vellum about this big, scrunched up, written in really difficult handwriting, in shorthand Latin, in a big box of other similar things, all of which are going mouldy in the Public Record Office in Kew. So that one I cannot answer, unfortunately. But at least we know they tried to put it together, and if they did find arsenic in the food, obviously the people concerned said they had no idea how it got there, and the servant said she had no idea how it got there when she delivered the meal. we won't know until somebody is feeling dedicated enough to go right through that particular set of documents, unfortunately. I suspect they probably weren't, if only because if they had been, there would have been more of a scandal. The names would have been better known, kind of gone down in history as some of the very few people, actually, who were hanged in Newcastle for anything in that kind of era other than for border reaving type crimes, which were still quite common. So that's one of the two little cases I wanted to tell you about, because it's really interesting. And the other one happened on this day in the past, 10th of June, 1725. And this involves a coal owner called William Cotesworth. And he drank his morning cup of chocolate and then became very ill. Now, he was probably having chocolate anyway because he was already recovering from an illness, although it was increasingly becoming a thing that you might just have a cup of hot chocolate in the morning. It was just on the cusp between being a medicinal drink and a drink that you'd just have, you know, with your breakfast for fun. But the severity of his symptoms raised suspicions. The doctors were called in, and the doctor said that he was lucky to survive what they said appeared to be a quite hefty dose of arsenic. So what on earth is going on here? Who would stick arsenic and attempt a death by chocolate situation? The staff are questioned, and the gardener quickly caves in and confesses. The gardener says that he has been persuaded by the butler, John Brown, to buy a large quantity of arsenic. Obviously, the gardener can go outside and move around more freely, and he might have a rat problem or a other vermin problem, so he can go and buy lots of arsenic and no one will care. And he said that John Brown had told him, "Oh, we will live bravely once it is done. It's worth it. You know, the two of us should do this. Once we've got Cotesworth out the way, we will live bravely." So, okay, who's this John Brown? Was it his idea? It seems like John Brown could not have been that bright, because the judge who heard this case, and this was all in Gateshead, so it's a Durham judge, said that they must have been prompted from outside, as so great and so vile an attempt was not the produce of the fellow's own brains. And while they were in prison, they started, again, we have a story of food being taken into prison as being relevant to the story. They started getting food and money from the agents of someone called Richard Ridley. Richard Ridley happened to have been John Brown's previous employer. He'd left the employ of Richard Ridley quite recently and gone straight into the employ as the butler of William Cotesworth, which, to be honest, seems like a really dumb thing for William Cotesworth to do, is to accept the butler of one of his main arch rivals, really. But he did, and this is what he got for it. The aid given was really blatant, which makes you think that Ridley knew that he was kind of untouchable in this circumstance. No one could ever pin it back as far as him. But it seems pretty likely, because if you look at the whole context, there is this massive rivalry between the two. And instead of this one being a kind of domestic dispute, this is a piece of industrial politics turned into violence. So we look at Cotesworth. Cotesworth is very much a self-made man. He starts his career on the quayside. Same year as Elizabeth Elstob is born, on the quayside, for those who were watching a week and a half ago. And he starts as a candle maker's apprentice. That's it. And he makes his way up through the ranks. As an employee, he marries into the firm, becomes a partner, becomes sole trader, becomes independent businessman, gradually financing bigger and bigger projects. Self-avowedly, he says, I am willing to deal in anything I can gain by. So, yeah, we'll trade in anything. But in practical terms, he's trading in salt and coal and lead. And Ridley is a little younger, from a slightly richer background, but again, not one of the big name gentry, not one of the few families that own vast swathes of land and they can just throw money into coal ventures and salt ventures. They're both having to work at it, but Ridley doesn't have to work quite as hard, and inevitably they become great rivals. Now, by 1720, 1715-ish, pretty much all the easily accessible coal is gone. So increasingly people are having to take gambles to get hold of more coal. There is a kind of pump that will do it, the Newcomen pump, but it is expensive to buy, it's expensive to run, and you never know for sure if it's going to get you coal at the bottom or not. So the whole thing becomes a really sort of risky venture. The whole thing could flood, could explode, it could get in noxious gases, it could accidentally go into under somebody else's land because land surveying isn't that good. And then there's also the problem of getting the coal to the river, because it's all done on these elaborate wagonways that are built privately to get that particular coal to the right place. Trouble with that is, what if you have to go over your rival's land to do it? So there's all sorts of money being passed around and all sorts of wheeler dealing going on in order to get coal to where it needs to be. And this leads, of course, to lots of feuds, lots of pacts, lots of plots. One participant describes the situation as every man for himself and God for us all. And also lots and lots of legal disputes. They're constantly taking each other to court for trespass and all sorts of civil things to do with land ownership. And they all pursue these things in court like crazy. Cotesworth himself seems to have been quite a difficult man to get on with. Well, one associate said that his idea of compromise is that the other person should compromise with him. And that was it. If he was right, the other people were wrong. He described his legal enemies, among other things, as a set of vile, oppressive, bloodthirsty men and incarnate devils. Part of this was because he had a chip on his shoulder. He thought that everyone was looking down on him because they were all from higher initial status than he was. So at least some of them genuinely did think he was, jumped up well above his proper rank in society, and he took that very badly. He'd got himself into so many lawsuits and so many land disputes. He was losing money left, right and centre, in lawyers, in rents, in coal he couldn't reach, in bills he couldn't collect, land he couldn't drain. As early as 10 years before his poisoning, one of his friends, Henry Liddell, was worried enough about a rumour of assassination to warn him, don't ride alone and unarmed. And over the next decade, he gets threatened and he gets beaten up at least a couple of times. These coal owners are constantly trying to set gangs on each other or on each other's servants, and there are fights on wagonways between gangs of two different people, both of whom say they own that bit of land. By 1725, there are 3 different disputes on the wagonways, over wagonways and over stolen coal, that are all in the courts at the same time. And if any one of them goes Cotesworth's way, it'll give him a big advantage and really help his situation. And maybe that's why Ridley gets desperate at that point. Maybe that's why he thinks, if any of this goes wrong, it's better to just bump the guy off. So he sends, we think, although, as I say, Ridley has never tried, he sends these men in, but the poisoning fails. He doesn't do too well, Ridley. He actually probably bungles an attempt to set an explosion in a mine a few days later and ends up killing several of his own men instead of several of his opposition's men because he gets the timing on the fuse wrong. So he's not necessarily that good at this kind of plotting. The 2 servants are, quite unusually for the time, found guilty. They're found guilty of an attempted murder. Obviously, if it had been murder, they would have been hanged. The standard punishment seems to be, certainly for a poisoning attempted murder, to be imprisoned and brought out and pilloried on 4 occasions. And the last one coincides with the anniversary of the event itself, which means that today, on this day in 1726, they were getting the end of their punishment. They were put in the pillory and also whipped while they were there. And this seems to be sort of standard for attempted poisoning. There's another case in Derby in 1732 where the crowd were said to be particularly harsh. The crowd gave no quarter and they threw eggs and turnips at the pilloried men. Cotesworth lives for a few months after the end of that, so sort of 18 months after he was first poisoned, dies in December 1726. But in that last 18 months of his life, he does some quite important things. He becomes a key figure in building the Grand Alliance of coal owners. He's not one of the big players in it, but he's supposed to be one of the people that get all the big players talking, the Montagues and the Liddells. And this becomes a massive sort of cartel of coal owners who dominate the coal industry for the next century even. So, you know, he does something quite meaningful before his death. And in fact, one of the things they started building in that 18 months, if you want to go and see something solid that relates back to this case, Causey Arch on the Tanfield Railway. They started building that during the same year as our poisoners were being pilloried and whipped on a regular basis. It's still the oldest surviving single arch railway bridge and is well worth a look if you're able to get out and look at things at the moment. And when you look up at it, you can think of William Cotesworth and whether or not he deserved to have death by chocolate. So that's that. Thank you very much for listening.